Hi everybody, I'm Becky Webber, Operations Director and Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Lead from Tate Recruitment, and you're listening to Tate Recruitment's podcast, Everyone's Got Talent, the show that discusses critical topics affecting business and society and raises awareness of hidden talent, which is going undiscovered to help you create better and more sustainable companies and that provides great work for great people. Each month we'll talk to experts about their work to help employers reach new talent communities and how they support job seekers in their careers. Inclusion and fairness in the workplace is not simply the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do, and now more than ever. We hope you can join us on this educational inclusion journey. In this episode, we'll discuss the impact of menopause in the workplace and practical steps to support and attract female employees. Did you know that every woman will experience menopause during their life, generally between the ages of 45 and 55? While 25% will sail through it, 75% will not, with many working through perimenopause and menopause, managing symptoms at work. Our guest, Bev Thorogood, author of The Business of Menopause and founder of Floresco Menopause Training, offers tailored in-person and e-learning training for staff and managers and a 6-month programme to create menopause champions within organisations. Bev's expertise, along with my operational insights as a product of her menopause champion training for Tate, will shed light on how business can retain talent and create a more inclusive work environment. So Bev, thank you very much for joining me on this podcast. It's lovely to have you on here. It would be great to start with if you could tell us a bit more about yourself and also what motivated you to start Floresco Training.
Thank you. Yes, of course. Thanks for having me, Becky. My journey around menopause started around about 7 years ago when I turned 50 and I was gifted my first hot flush on my 50th birthday, which was a treat. And I have to be honest, I knew nothing about menopause. My mum had died when I was 22, so that wasn't a conversation we'd ever had. And if I'm honest, I thought it was just about hot flushes and women getting a bit snappy with their husbands. You know, I was so ignorant, it's untrue. And basically when that hot flush hit, and I thought that was the start of my, the journey through menopause, I was totally unprepared for the following 2 years of symptoms that I'd never have associated with menopause. Things like anxiety, fatigue, loss of confidence, brain fog. Nobody had ever spoken to me about those things before. And although we chatted at work with the women that I worked with about menopause, it was still really just about, are the hot flushes causing you a problem? So long story short, after 2 years of really struggling with quite severe symptoms, I ended up resigning. I'd worked for the MOD for 32 years, so long career, most of that working for the Royal Air Force. And I did ask for a period of 12 months special unpaid leave, and because of financial restrictions, that was turned down, which was, I guess it was disappointing at the time, but these things happen for a reason, don't they? So I ended up resigning in March 2018, so just nearly 5 years ago. And very soon after that, by a weird twist of fate, the head office at Royal Air Force, High Wycombe, got in touch and asked if I would deliver some menopause training. There's a bit of a background to that. I'd obviously done lots of research. My background it was in learning and development. So they asked me if I would deliver a couple of workshops, which I delivered on World Menopause Day 2018, which is, happens every year. And that's where the whole business started from, because I suddenly realised, talking to the women in the workshop that I ran, had about 30 women in there, how ignorant we all are to this. And it's not just, in the workplace, it's not just the men in the workplace or those young women who've never experienced it. It's all of us. None of us get any education around this. And it seemed to me that you can't deal with a problem that you don't even know exists. So I started from that session with the Royal Air Force, asking around to find out what businesses were doing, if anything, about menopause, and found out that 5 years ago they weren't doing much. Thankfully, things have changed, but that's where the Floresco journey really started. And in that 5 years, I've been very fortunate to work with some amazing businesses, Tate included. everything from sort of public sector organisations through to people like Channel 4 and large corporates, which has been brilliant. And the sea change is happening. We are seeing more conversation. But basically, that was a very long-winded answer around how I ended up doing what I'm doing now.
Well, the good news is that even though you left the MOD, some good came from it. It's quite ironic, isn't it, that they asked you back to do the training, but that's where it all began. And we're very grateful that it did, Bev. So, and I'm very grateful that I've learnt from you too. So in terms of Floresco's mission, what actually is it? What's your sort of purpose behind it? We know the reason why you set it up, but what's the purpose behind what you want to achieve?
I have a very simple mission, and that's to make menopause mainstream. You mentioned it in the introduction. We need to make it a normalised conversation without any stigma, without any embarrassment around it. We need to make it a conversation that can be had without fear of it being career limiting or that you're going to be judged negatively. It needs to be as mainstream as saying, I've got a broken foot and I need a bit of support while it mends. And at the minute it's not, but we're getting there.
Absolutely. And we are. So for the benefit of the audience, it'd be really good if we could give an overview of what menopause actually is. So can you just describe what is menopause?
Absolutely. So menopause it's literally just the stopping of our monthly periods. It's the point at which we're no longer able to reproduce. Our periods have stopped. It's classed as 12 months from the date of our last period. So menopause itself is just a day. It's the day 12 months from the date of somebody's last period, which sounds very easy, but it's actually quite difficult for a lot of women to know when that has happened. So when we think about menopause and the impact of menopause, actually we're talking about perimenopause, which is the lead up to menopause. It's the point at which the ovaries begin to shut down, our sex hormones begin to decline. And that normally happens somewhere between 3 to 4 years, maybe up to as much as 10 or 12 years before somebody actually is period free and has reached menopause. So I guess you can look at our reproductive lifespan in stages. We've got sort of prepubescent, before we start our periods. We hit puberty and our periods start. We're premenopausal, all of the years that we're just in our normal reproductive years. We hit perimenopause, the ovaries begin to shut down. We reach menopause when the periods stop. And then from that date onwards, we're postmenopausal until the day we leave this mortal coil. So there's quite clear sort of demarcations in our reproductive life cycle. But menopause is that time when the reproductive system is shutting down.
And from an employer's and a line manager's perspective, what's the information they need to know about menopause in the workplace? What would be most helpful for them?
I think the biggest bit of information is that it's not what you might think it is. It's not just an older woman's issue. It's not just something that affects women in their mid to late 50s. As you said in your introduction, menopause itself, that point at which the periods stop, for most women, about 95% of women will happen somewhere between 45 and 55. But actually, there's a lot of assumptions we make. One is that it only affects women, when in reality, anybody who's ever owned a set of ovaries, regardless of how they identify now, so transgender, non-binary people, if they've had periods at any time or if they've, were born with female genitalia, they're likely to experience menopause. So that's an assumption we need to move away from. But also menopause actually can happen at any age. About 1 in 100 women reach menopause under 40, about 1 in 1,000 under 30. And it can be as young as sort of teenagers, early 20s. So I think the biggest bit of information I would want to get across to employers is don't make the assumption that this is an older woman's issue. This can affect anybody at any age, and it's not just a female issue either.
Yeah, very good point. And I'm glad you said that, because absolutely it's, we have these assumptions, which we will move on to shortly into the conversation. So again, from a employer's perspective, because we're talking about how line managers can support people through this stage of their life, what are the most common symptoms that impact those transitioning menopause at work?
Yeah, I think we're all unique. Everybody's got to experience it differently. But there are some themes that seem to come through. And I think hot flushes, we've got to mention them. A lot of women find that the hot flushes are quite debilitating. But often hot flushes don't appear until quite late in the perimenopausal journey. The common ones, I think, that are sometimes misdiagnosed or are not recognised as menopause are things like increased levels of anxiety, getting anxious about things that maybe you've not been anxious about before, speaking in public, standing up in meetings, driving on the commute to work. Those sort of things that people have taken for granted can suddenly become problematic. So anxiety is an issue, low mood changes, but fatigue, insomnia and fatigue leading to exhaustion. There's an awful lot of changes happening biologically as we go through perimenopause, which can lead to tiredness. It can mess up your sleep. So yeah, basically things like the psychological symptoms. You can kind of categorize the symptoms, Becky, into three areas. You've got physical symptoms, the psychological and emotional symptoms, and cognitive symptoms. And I think one of the areas that affects women in the workplace more than anything are the cognitive changes. So we tend to use the term brain fog. But what does that actually mean? For a lot of women, it's a loss of concentration, finding it very difficult to focus on complex information. It's memory issues, not remembering simple words. And of course, if you're standing up, giving a presentation, or you've got to brief somebody in a meeting, and suddenly you lose your concentration, you lose your focus, you can't remember the words you want to say, it can be incredibly embarrassing. You can start to feel like you're losing competence. So brain fog, I think, is one of the biggest symptoms, along with anxiety, fatigue, and the hot flushes, of course. But there are lots of others, things like aching joints and muscle soreness can make sitting down at a desk for long periods difficult. Urinary tract changes can mean that you need more frequent breaks to go to the loo. It's very hard to define exactly what's going to cause the biggest problem, but I would say the ones to really be aware of are the cognitive and the psychological symptoms.
That's really insightful, Bev. Thank you very much for sharing that. So let's talk about the impact of menopause on the workplace then. In another episode of Tate's podcast, we discussed with Lindsay Simpson, the founder of 55 Redefined, the impact of an increasingly ageing population and the need to look after our older workforce. And just to stress the reality of the effect of an ageing population, I'm going to throw in a few statistics here. By 2030, according to the Centre for Economics and Business Research, so the CEBR, the proportion of over 50s in the UK workforce will reach a record high of 47%. That's only a few years away. And by 2050, our working age population will reduce by 25%. So we've got two factors playing against each other there. So when you consider, as I've alluded to before, that women make up nearly half of the workforce and 75% of women aged between 45 and 55 will experience menopause symptoms, it's evident that menopause is a workplace issue that businesses can ill afford to ignore.
Absolutely. Yeah, the impact here is we know that we're leaching talent at this menopausal phase in women's lives. I'm going to say women, not because I want to be exclusionary here, but we have data about women. We have very little data about the transgender communities. So I will sort of use the word woman, but I hope that's sort of understandable. So we are leaching really quite valuable female talent at the point they reach this perimenopausal stage. Different studies have given different numbers. I think it's very hard to be precise about how many women are actually leaving the workforce. I think the Fawcett Society said 1 in 10, which equates in the UK to around about 333,000 women. A report by Bupa put that number at 900,000. That's quite a big difference. I think it's hard to define exactly how many, but the impact is that businesses, if they don't recognise and support women, are actually likely to be losing some of their top talent. You're talking about women who've probably been employed for 25, 30 years. They've built up a huge amount of experience and knowledge and skill. And that knowledge and skill and experience doesn't disappear because we're menopausal. It might be clouded by brain fog and a bit of a lack of confidence, but it's still there. And if businesses aren't open to the fact that they need to support people through this transition, they're going to lose them and not get them back. A little bit of support in the middle means that by the time we get out of menopause or we get through this phase, we come back into the workforce not only with that same level of experience, knowledge, skill and talent, but actually with far more valuable, because we've got fewer distractions and all of that experience and wisdom. So I think it doesn't make sense to write women off when they hit menopause. We've got so much to bring to the table still.
100%. I'm one of those women. And I've got so much more to give, without a doubt. And I also know from an operational perspective that there is a massive business benefit of prioritising menopause on the people agenda, because it impacts productivity, attrition, well-being, employee engagement, and also absenteeism as well. And when we consider we are in an ageing population, we're going to have more women, transgender people experiencing menopause, travelling through our workforces. And so those numbers will grow. And so being proactive and having plans and actions and support strategies in place will play out and be so beneficial further down the line when we have other issues that other issues that we're challenged by, which is finding and retaining talent, which is the core of the success of any business. Let's be honest. So, Bev, you're aware, I know, that I shared my menopause story, funny enough, on International Women's Day last year, which was the 8th of March. And I did so with our head of culture and our head of people. At the time of sharing, talking about menopause was reliant on having a good relationship with your manager and whether you felt comfortable asking for support. And thankfully, I always have. So I feel very fortunate. So whilst I'm lucky, I wanted to raise the topic in case some people might be struggling in silence without the support they needed to thrive, because you can thrive through menopause with the right support. But societal stigmas made me nervous about raising the issue. I needn't have worried because the conversation went exceptionally well, but it has made me consider that others might not share their story because of judgment. And I think that's, a fact. For us in Tate, great things have happened since. And while menopause is being talked about more of late, stigmas and taboos do not disappear overnight, as we very well know. But in your experience, what common perceptions do you still see and hear about menopause?
I think that exactly as you've just said, this fear that you're going to be judged, that by opening up, people are going to see you differently. People are going to judge you differently. I think a lot of women fear that if they open up about what they're going through, it's going to put the brakes on their career. They may be overlooked for promotions. It may not help them if they're going for jobs. You've already talked about ageism. I would love to think it didn't exist, but I think it does. We talked offline about the difficulties of the recruitment process for older people anyway. So I think that the feeling I get from most women that I speak to is, well, they seem to sit in two camps. We've got people like yourself who are willing to talk. Yes, there might be a bit of bravery needed to step out and talk about it, but the cause is good enough. There are others who maybe their own upbringing has always meant that anything female related, anything to do with the sort of the female reproductive system, periods or anything like that, we just don't talk about.
So, Bev, let's talk about what employers can do. What practical and actionable steps can employers take to ensure their people feel supported and to retain their people through menopause?
Yeah, I think there's a number of things. There's certainly best practice out there. If you read anything from people like the Chartered Institute for Personnel and Development, they put forward some best practice. In simple terms, sometimes just having some sort of guidance, documentation, or a policy, perhaps, if it's the right fit for the organisation. I'm not sure a formal policy always is, but having some form of handbook or guide or a page on an intranet site that gives some direction, I think does a number of things. First of all, it gives a very clear message that the organisation at least acknowledges that menopause is an issue. It also gives line managers, HR managers direction as to how to potentially deal with somebody and manage somebody if they are struggling. And it also gives colleagues the reassurance that they've got somewhere that they can go to get information. So I think a policy or guidance is good. It's not, I don't think it's a starting point. I think training, of course, I'm a trainer, so I see this as a high priority. But for me, my lack of education was the biggest issue I had in sorting myself out, actually, because it's not all about relying on the organisation to put everything in place, but we don't get educated anywhere else. So the workplace seems like a very sensible place to start educating people. 80% of those experiencing menopause are in work, so the workplace seems like a good option. So training for managers, so they understand what menopause is, maybe start to break down some of the biases and assumptions. Training as well for HR teams, maybe, so they understand what is things like, where does menopause fit within the Equality Act? Is it covered by health and safety law? These things aren't always explicit, so training HR teams and what have you to understand what the implications are if they get this wrong is helpful. But also, of course, training colleagues to understand what they're going through and what treatment options and support they can be asking for, what they can do to help themselves as well. So a policy, training, and then really doing what you're doing, making it a conversation that is open. I think one of the most impactful things that can happen is for senior managers, especially female managers, to be a bit vulnerable and share what they're going through. Because if people at the top are open, it gives the message that those at lower grades or lower levels will be equally supported if they open up about it. You can't underestimate the impact of seeing senior leaders talking about this. And I think that comes down to kind of creating the right culture. So training, talking about it, having resources readily available. You mentioned menopause champions. I think sometimes having people embedded within an organisation that people know they've had maybe a bit of extra training, they've got a bit more knowledge, they're able to signpost in, to further resources. That can be helpful as well. And then, of course, we've got reasonable adjustments, so workplace adjustments and workplace adaptations. Most of the adjustments that will be helpful for those experiencing menopause are fairly simple, fairly cheap, normally cost neutral. They don't cost anything. So being, I guess, when it comes to reasonable adjustments, organisations need to be enabling managers to have the ability to have some level of autonomy over how they support their teams, and not have to jump through lots of hoops to get somebody a 10 quid desk fan, for example. So they can look at processes and look at systems to see if they're menopause friendly. So it is practical stuff, really. It's not it's not expensive, I don't think, to start to make a difference.
I completely agree. And from an operational perspective, like I said at the beginning, I've been leading the menopause movement, if you like, within Tate for over a year now. And like with anything, it always feels a bit overwhelming to start with. But there's an awful lot you can do by talking to other businesses, networking with organisations that may be a few steps ahead of you, to learn about how they've implemented certain procedures or processes or awareness or whatever it might be, so that you can piggyback, if you like, on the back of that, and then obviously pass that knowledge on as you learn too. And I've certainly done that. And one of the biggest things that I did at the beginning was rally supporters. In fact, I didn't really have to try very hard, because it's funny, when you open up your mouth about something that's important to other people, they come willingly towards you. So if you can build a team of people, and ideally across different business operational areas, so that includes, the HR team, the people team, maybe the legal team, your front-facing team, from all levels, then you have the opportunity to hear a lot more people's voices, if you like. And so you can together achieve so much more. But certainly from Tate's perspective, we've accelerated our movement, not only from the amazing training of the 6 months menopause champion training I've had from Bev, but also from networking within the group that Bev teaches, and also beyond that as well with other organisations. So it's just being brave enough to reach out and have informational chats with other organisations to learn from them, which you can do on any topic, to accelerate knowledge and to become stronger and better and create more robust procedures or whatever.
I just wanted to say that I think, sadly, there are a few organisations who are... They're putting on training, or they're doing something maybe once a year for International Women's Day or for Menopause Awareness Day in October. They'll put on a training, they'll throw a webinar in there. And I run webinars. I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it's not enough. It's just a conversation starter. A tick box, yes, we've done the webinar for menopause, that's that done. Or any other subject that has, a big impact. You can't just throw on a webinar and say we've done menopause. It has to be more strategic than that. It has to be more integrated. I think there's a danger that if you're not careful as an organisation, you can think you've done something and actually not done much at all. And some of the feedback, we've certainly run webinars, one-off webinars for companies, and it's not my preferred way of doing things. Not that I think they need to bring me back and back and back, but our training should be the springboard for other things happening within the organisation. And I've had women who've come and joined my Facebook group after a webinar that I've run for a company, and they've fed back to me, do you know what? 6 months later, that's all we've had. Nobody ever mentioned it again. We feel like they gave us the information and then we're still left with nothing. And of course, that's frustrating, because now those people have got a bit of knowledge and they want the support and feel like they can't tap into it because nothing else is happening. And I know that's not the way you've done things at Tate. You've taken that starting point, which was your opening up on your video, but you've continued the conversation. You've continued to make sort of steps towards keeping that conversation alive. And I think that's the danger that a lot of businesses will make, is thinking it's a one and done.
Yeah, I agree. We're just in the process of just finishing off our menopause toolkit, so we've opted away from the policy, but more practical toolkits that managers can use. And I think the other point I'm just going to make before we kind of wrap up the session today is that you don't need to be an expert. And I think there's that fear as a line manager that you need to know the ins and outs of everything to be able to do a great job and support a member of your team. If you have enough knowledge to be able to signpost people to the right resources to help them, but also to put the adjustments in if appropriate, that don't need to cost anything in the vast majority of cases, to make someone's life easier and to enable them to perform so that the symptoms don't impact their performance within the workplace so greatly, then you're doing an amazing job and you should commend yourself on doing a real, that's amazing. So don't think for a minute you have to be an expert. You don't. That was one of the points I was just going to make, because there is always that fear. So Bev, thank you so much for sharing such insightful information. I've got one final question for you, and we're going to fast forward, if you can imagine fast forwarding to the future. And I asked the same question of all my guests on our podcast, which is, can you describe what success looks like for you in 10 years' time?
So I think ideally we won't be, I'll be out of a job, so I won't be talking about menopause, because that will all have been sorted and everybody will be perfectly comfortable talking about menopause. I think there's an awful lot of hormonal changes that we're starting to realise impact women because we're cyclical more than men. And I think one of those is things like ADHD and neurodiversity. And I think in 10 years' time, in an ideal world, the next conversation that will have been addressed and looked at in the same way that we're seeing the movement in menopause will be the impact of hormones and neurodiversity. So in 10 years' time, I would like to think that good research has been done into the impact of hormonal changes on women in all areas of their life, because I think neurodiversity, menopause, and all of those other conditions that you talked about already, things like endometriosis, will have the research that they deserve.
Thanks so much, Bev, for sharing your valuable insights and expertise with us today. It's been incredibly insightful and thought-provoking, and I'm sure our listeners have gained huge amounts from it.
Thanks for having me, Becky. It's my pleasure.
To help you digest all the information we've shared with you today, we have prepared a one-page document summarising the key takeaways from today's episode and providing links to Bev's website and additional resources. We hope you've enjoyed this episode and found it informative. And if you did, please consider subscribing to our podcast and leaving us a review. Sharing it with friends and colleagues is also a great way to spread the word. So thanks for tuning in, and we look forward to bringing you more insightful discussions in the future. If you'd like a copy of the top tips from today's episode, please go to www.tate.co.uk/podcast.